Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining Back to Basics Part 2, a step-by-step guide to sponsoring a skilled worker. For those of you who don't know, I'm Elaine McIlroy. I'm one of the partners in the Employment and Immigration team at Brodie's. And with me today is Erin McLafferty, who's an associate in the team, and we'll each be covering part of the session. So I'm going to start with the agenda. So we're going to cover a number of topics, how to check who is eligible for sponsorship under the skilled worker route, how to apply for and assign a certificate of sponsorship, completing the visa application form itself and what supporting documents need to be submitted by the applicant, urgent applications, timing and costs, and I'll touch just at the end on something about record keeping and reporting requirements. But as I said at the beginning, this is part 2 of our Back to Basics session. Some of you might have joined us for our first session, which was about applying for a sponsor license. And if you do need to access that, it's available online on Brodie's website. And the third part of our series is going to be about compliance obligations that go along with having a sponsor license. So although we'll touch on record keeping at the end, that will be addressed in more detail in our next session, which you can sign up for. Before we get into the detail of eligibility criteria, I guess the good news generally about the skilled worker route, which opened up about just over a year ago, so to coincide with the end of the Brexit transition period. But the good news is that it's become much more easy and straightforward and fast to sponsor someone to come to work for you in the UK. Lots of employers, if they haven't dealt with sponsorship over the past year, might think it's more complicated than it is, because under the old rules, employers used to have to carry out, in many cases, what was called a resident labour market test, so showing that they couldn't find somebody from the resident workforce that could do the job. And it used to be pretty restrictive in terms of who could be sponsored, so only highly skilled people or specialist roles, etc. But for the past year or so, it's become much easier than it was before. So in terms of the eligibility criteria, and we are just going to deal with the skilled worker route today. There are obviously other visa categories out there, and I'm not going to cover intercompany transfers today, but we may do that in another session. But under the skilled worker route, the first question an employer needs to address when considering if they can sponsor somebody is whether the job is skilled enough. And it's the employer's job to match up the role that you've got in mind with a job code. And these job codes are available on UKVI's website. There is a document that sets out a list of all of those job codes which are suitable for sponsorship, and it tells you alongside there what the kind of minimum salary requirements are for that role. There's, I guess, 2 lists of jobs. There's the shortage occupation list, which is a list of jobs which are deemed to be in short supply, and there are benefits if your job code falls under that. And then there is just the skilled worker route job list, which is a much broader list. And all of those jobs on the list will be either medium skilled or highly skilled jobs. Around a year ago, when they changed the rules and introduced the new point system, they approximately doubled the range of jobs which are suitable for sponsorship. So it might be a larger list than you would expect if you haven't come across sponsorship recently. And it's ultimately the employer's job to match up the job that you've got with the best fit in terms of a job code. It doesn't need to be a perfect match. It's just a case of looking at what's there and coming up with the closest match possible. And there is an ONS occupation coding tool which you can use if you need help with matching up the job that you've got with the closest job code. Now, with each of those job codes, there'll be a minimum going rate, which will be specified alongside it, which the employer has to pay if you want to be able to sponsor someone. There is also a minimum sort of baseline threshold that must be paid for a job to be suitable for sponsorship under the skilled worker route. That's currently 25,600, but there are exceptional cases where a lower baseline of as low as £20,480 applies, but that only applies to specific situations. So the sorts of situations in which an employer can pay less than 25,600 are if the job appears in the shortage occupation list, or if the individual has a PhD or a PhD in a STEM subject, there are various discounts that apply, and a PhD in a STEM subject benefits from even more discounts than a PhD. Or if the individual qualifies for the special rules on what are called new entrants. And new entrants are those who are under the age of 26, or if they're switching into the skilled worker route from a student visa or a graduate visa, or if they're undertaking certain professional qualifications. So when looking at the salary requirements, then there's the going rate for the particular job code, and you do need to make sure you're paying that. There is that minimum general salary threshold of 25,600, or certain exceptional cases where it might be lower, and the employer must pay the higher of those two. And then in almost every case, they must also pay, or make sure that they're paying at least £10.10 an hour. There's certain limited exceptions to that. But once the employer has gone through that process of checking, is the job skilled enough, is it paid enough according to the minimum requirements, then generally there is not much extra that you sort of need to check in order to satisfy yourself that you can sponsor the person. There are English language requirements, and there is a financial or maintenance requirement, which I'll come on to talk about when we look at the visa application process. But generally those are fairly easy to satisfy. And the only other reason why someone may not be refused a visa might be, for example, if they had a criminal record or a poor record of compliance with UK immigration requirements, for example, if they'd overstayed previously or had a sort of poor immigration record. But apart from those two key things, it's usually relatively straightforward to go ahead with the sponsorship process, and that is very different from the old rules where there was that resident labour market test and where there was also an immigration cap, etc., to worry about. So all of that has fallen away. So if we just turn to the next slide, Erin's going to take over from here for a bit.
Yeah, so I'm going to take you through then how to apply for and assign what we call a certificate of sponsorship, or the COS, as we sometimes call it. And I guess a certificate of sponsorship is a digital document that links the sponsor to the candidate or the employee in question, and vice versa, the employee to the sponsor who's going to undertake their sponsorship. It is important to go through the process that Elaine just mentioned of checking that the job is skilled enough and that it meets the minimum salary requirements, because UKVI do expect that when you come to the point of applying for and assigning the certificate of sponsorship, that you are confirming to them that that is the case and that the candidate you have in mind does meet those requirements. When you come to apply, you do need to think about what type of certificate of sponsorship that you need. And I guess there's two types. There is the defined certificate of sponsorship, which is for those you wish to sponsor who are based outside of the UK at the point that you're applying or starting to go through this sponsorship process. And then there's what we call the undefined certificate of sponsorship, and that's for people who are based inside the UK, whether it be through a student visa, or perhaps are working for another employer under the skilled worker route and you're taking over their sponsorship. But it's really anyone who's already here in the UK with a valid visa and will be applying to come and work for you from inside the UK. Undefined is also always used for intercompany transfer routes, and although we're not talking about it today, it is just important to note that if you do use that on your licence, it will always be undefined whether the candidate is overseas or in the UK, although that's more unlikely. It is really important to know the difference between the two types and when to use each one. The process for applying for and assigning is different for both, and we'll chat through each of them in the next slides. But UKVI do consider it a really serious breach if you use the wrong one, and they can take action against you, including up to revoking your licence in extreme cases. And UKVI won't always pick up that you've used the wrong one if you have, and sometimes that's not deliberate and it's inadvertent. But don't think just because UKVI haven't flagged that to you that you've used the right one. The responsibility does lie with the sponsor, so do always pull out the guidance or take advice if you're unsure on which one to use. So on the next slide then, we've just kind of specified the overall process. So first of all, you have to apply for the relevant certificate of sponsorship. Once you've done that, you will then what we call assign it to the migrant worker in question. And then finally, the individual will make their own visa application. From the sponsor's point of view, the main things you will be involved in are stage 1 and 2, so applying and assigning. And once you have assigned the certificate of sponsorship to your candidate, you will be provided with a unique, what we call cost number, and that's the kind of magic number that the candidate will need in order to make a valid visa application. So for stage one then, in relation to applying, on the next slide, we've got some details on how you do that under the undefined process. And the main thing to note for undefined certificates of sponsorship is that all sponsors will get what's called an allocation of these every year. So you will almost have a kind of bank of these that sit on your license ready to be used if and when you need them. It's definitely a privilege and not a right to have these sitting on your license, and UKVI will think about a number of factors when they grant them, including credibility or past non-compliance. So it's never a guarantee that you will get them, but as long as you're keeping up to speed on your compliance, most sponsors don't have a major problem with this. But you do always need to be able to justify the number that you're requesting. So the more detail that you can provide, for example, on the roles that you've got to fill, or if you've got candidates whose visas are expiring in the coming year, it's important to give that level of detail in your application. If you're unsure whether you need any, you can make what we call a speculative application, and you can just ask for some because you might need them. But UKVI are not obliged to give you any, and they can, in a lot of cases, provide you with less. So quite often, if you ask for 4 or 5, just because you like to have them, it's more likely you'll get 1 or 2, and in some cases you might not get any if you haven't used them in the past, and UKVI kind of don't have any justification for why you need that many. But because of that, lots of employers ask, well, what happens if we use up our allocation, or what if we're not granted any and we suddenly have someone that we need to sponsor? It is, of course, quite hard in some cases to anticipate whether you're going to need to sponsor someone, particularly on an undefined basis. So if you do need to do it unexpectedly, there is a process for applying for an undefined cost outside of that allocation process that I mentioned. And on the next slide, we'll go through that quickly. So there is a screenshot there from the sponsor management system. And I guess the first step would be to log on, go to the section that says license summary applications and services, and then you will see the section that's highlighted there that says request COS or CAS allocation increase. And this screen is quite helpful, and it shows you, depending on the type of license that you've got, it will show you the number of certificates of sponsorship you've got for undefined, and how many you've used in that current allocation year, and how many you've got remaining. If you need to apply to add to that, you will click on the add request button that you can see there on the screen for the appropriate category. And I suppose when you're making an additional request to supplement your annual allocation, it should always be on an as needed basis. These shouldn't usually be speculative, and UKVI will normally expect to see quite a lot of detail in that justification. So you should be usually trying to put in detail about the job title that the candidate will be undertaking for you, the job code that you've identified, the salary that individual will be paid, and also details of that candidate themselves. So if they are inside the UK already on a visa, you would need to probably be explaining that, just so that UKVI can ensure this is the appropriate route. On the next slide, we've then got the defined process. So the defined process is different, and these are always applied for on an as needed basis. So you will always have to have a candidate in mind, and the form itself does request specific information on job codes and salaries and things like that. So do make sure you've got that to hand. The way that you go through the process is to click on the workers screen on the left-hand side of the SMS, which we've got on the screenshot there, and then you'll go into the defined COS section. So it is important to make sure you do everything in relation to the defined application, and then when you assign it under that defined COS section, and you will see the button there that says apply for a defined COS, and it will tell you exactly the information that it needs from you. UKVI do say that the processing time on this type of cost is around 1 working day. So that is good and it is quick, and that is because you will usually be applying as and when you need. That does contrast with the undefined process. So if you have to supplement your allocation for undefined COS, it is important to know that the processing time for those applications is up to 18 weeks. For a lot of employers, if you've got a candidate that you want to employ, you usually don't have 18 weeks to spare. So there is a priority service that's available for undefined COS when you're applying for them. It does cost £200 and most employers get a response in 5 working days. So do just remember that that exists. All the information is on the government webpage. But when you're going through the sponsorship process, it is important to kind of think about that from the get-go because the timing is slightly different for both types. So when you're applying for the defined cost, as I said, you've got to input certain information that it asks for. So things like salary, job code and description, job title, work start dates and end dates, and also whether the client will be working on a client contract. There are some rules in relation to that are in place in the guidance. So I would always recommend that you pull out the guidance and check if you are eligible to send staff out on a client contract or not, or do speak to a solicitor or an immigration advisor on that point, because it's not always possible. So on the next slide then, I've got a screenshot that shows you how to then do the next stage, which is to assign the certificate of sponsorship. If you've got an undefined certificate and it's been granted, you will normally get an email to say you've been successful, it's been granted, or if your undefined cost is already sitting there, you will be able to just go straight to this stage of assigning it. To do so, you will go onto the SMS and you will go back into the worker section, but you will go to create and assign at the top. When you go in there, it's going to populate or create a form, and you're going to have to populate the answers in there. It's very specific about what it wants, but this is the stage when you're assigning it that you're really crystallizing the fact that you're going to sponsor this person and that they're going to come and work for you. So the form is looking for a lot more detail in relation to that individual, such as their name, their nationality, place of birth, date of birth, their passport details, address, and things like that. It is possible to go in, have a look at the form, see the information you need, and then go back to it. So if you need to do that, that's absolutely fine. But just make sure you're going to the right section for defined or undefined. On the next slide, we have just a screenshot to show you where you find this, a very, very similar form, but under the defined process. And it's, as you can see on the left-hand side, where it says defined cost, you will go into that. And then halfway down the page, it says granted applications, create and assign defined COS. And that's where you will go if you are going through the defined process. The form is very, very similar. It will pull through a bit more information if it's a defined COS, and that's just because you've put more information in at the application stage under that route. So just bear in mind the process is different and to go to the same section. Also thought I would flag that under both types of certificate of sponsorship, there is a question on there asking whether the candidate requires an ATAS certificate. And that's really an enhanced security background check that the candidate might need for certain roles and in certain circumstances. For the vast majority of sponsors, the answer to that question will almost always be no, unless you're also a student sponsor. So do always double check if that applies to you. If it doesn't, it's very unlikely that an ATAS certificate is going to be needed. And it's really for those candidates who are going to be working in roles that are regarded as being subject to kind of high security thresholds. So if you're working on certain government kind of projects, sometimes you will need one of these ATAS certificates. If you're ever unsure if it applies, there is detailed guidance on it, but it's now a mandatory question on the certificate of sponsorship form, so just worth being aware of. And I guess once you've been through that, filled in the form, populated the information, you will then go to the next stage to assign it, and that's when you're going to make the payments that are required. And Elaine will talk a bit about the cost specifically in a few slides time, but the main ones you'll pay at this stage are the certificate of sponsorship fee, if applicable, and that's £199, and then the immigration skills charge, which can vary depending on the length of the visa. But you will need access to a card to do this. You need to kind of pay for it as if you're kind of doing online shopping. You can't be invoiced for it afterwards. So just bear that in mind, that you will need access to a card at this stage. So I'll pass on or pass back to Elaine, and she'll chat about the next stage, which is the visa itself.
Thanks, Erin. Yes, I'm going to touch on, I guess, the sort of final stage at this point. So completing the visa application form, and also to touch on what supporting documents the person's likely to need to submit along with that visa application form. So the first stage, I guess, is for the employer to provide that certificate of sponsorship reference number that Erin mentioned. The individual needs that to input into their online visa application form. they'll go to the UK VI website and create their visa form, and they'll plug in all their sort of personal information, name, date of birth, nationality, details of their parents and residential addresses, etc. into that. Most of that information is fairly straightforward for the visa applicant to complete themselves, but they will also need to think about what supporting documents they might need to submit with their application. For most people, that will be a passport, and in some cases, if the person is applying for their visa from a country that they're not a national of, but they're resident in, they might need evidence that they're resident in that country as well. They may need evidence of their English language ability. So I mentioned at the outset, individuals need to show that in order to qualify under the skilled worker route. They can do that in a number of ways, either through their passport, if they're from certain countries where English is the first language, it might just be their passport that they submit, or they might need to do an English language test and produce evidence of having sat that, and there's various requirements attached to that. It needs to be recent, etc. And undertaken in certain test facilities, or they can demonstrate the English language requirement if they have undertaken a degree that was taught in English at certain universities, etc. So one of those forms of evidence would usually need to be submitted. There is also a financial or maintenance requirement that I mentioned at the beginning. In many cases, the employer will simply certify using the online sponsor management system that Erin was talking about, that they will guarantee this maintenance requirement. And that's basically a sort of confirmation that if the individual needed funds in the first month that they spent in the UK, then the employer would guarantee it up to that amount of £1,270. In the vast majority of cases, that guarantee is never sort of called up, but it's the simplest way to meet that maintenance requirement is for the employer to verify that just by ticking a box on the online system. Otherwise, the individual would need to submit bank account statements to show that they've had that those funds in their bank account for 30 days before the application. But in some cases, it's more tricky to do that because there's specific requirements about the evidence needed. So I'd say, and would usually recommend the employer certifies the maintenance requirement for that. An individual may also need a TB test certificate. That depends on where they've been living in the period before they're planning to come to the UK, and there's a list online of who it is that needs to submit that. Some individuals might need to also submit evidence of criminal record checks, but that's only for certain roles. And then finally, things like marriage certificates or birth certificates may be needed if the individual's bringing dependents with them. And if they are bringing dependents with them, like a spouse or children, etc., each of those individuals will each need to create a visa application form, and there'll be a separate fee attached to that for each person that's applying. Just a few extra points on completing the visa application stage. Just be aware, I guess, if you're assisting an employee sort of through a visa application, etc., that generally immigration advice is regulated and can only usually be provided by lawyers or OISC regulated immigration advisors. There is, however, an exception to that which allows sponsors. So if you've got your organisation has a sponsor licence and you're employed by them, it allows sponsors to provide assistance in relation to an employer or job applicant applying through the skilled worker route for a visa, as long as that is free of charge and provided by the sponsor itself. But it may not, that exception might not cover or is unlikely to cover external advice by things like HR consultants, etc. So just be, I guess, mindful of that regulatory piece there. And although employers, and some will go ahead and do all of this themselves, especially if you're doing it on a regular basis, you might become familiar with the rules. Many will still take advice because the rules do change a lot. And I would say the devil is in the detail. I guess today is an overview of the requirements, but always do consult the detailed policy guidance, which is available online, because it does break it down and give you all the sort of detail that you need there. So just to touch on urgent applications, timing and costs, and I guess we've got different timing, etc., depending on, and different costs as well, depending on whether the person is inside the UK or applying from outside of the UK. So if we start from the situation where the person's inside of the UK, that undefined cost process that Erin outlined, as Erin said, if you don't have a certificate of sponsorship already, it might take up to 18 weeks to get one, but for the vast majority of employers, they'll go ahead if they don't have one and use that expedited service. So you should factor in about 5 working days from when you submit your application for that to get the certificate of sponsorship. Next stage is then going ahead assigning the certificate of sponsorship, which is pretty much an instant process you can do straight away. At that point, I guess in terms of costs, you need to think about paying for the immigration skills charge, and that's a sort of a government tax effectively on employers for sponsored migrant workers, and it's either £1,000 per year of the visa, or for smaller employers there's a cost of £364 per year of the visa. And again, the policy guidance has got information online about who qualifies as a large employer and who gets the benefit of that smaller fee. There is also the flat fee of £199, which Erin mentioned, for the certificate sponsorship itself, although certain Europeans and others may be exempt from that. And then there is a fee, of course, for submitting the visa application. I've put up onto there this sort of costs for the visa application itself, which depends on the length of the visa that you're applying for. It's cheaper for a shorter period, etc. And then just to bear in mind that the individual themselves also needs to pay the immigration health surcharge, which is a cost towards the NHS, and that's usually £624 per year of the visa. And the application can take 8 weeks from inside of the UK, but there are priority services available with an extra fee. Process and timing then for outside of the UK, as Erin mentioned, just a day to get the defined certificate of sponsorship, which is much quicker. Assigning the certificate of sponsorship is then an instant process, which is much quicker. The same charges in terms of the immigration skills charge, the same costs for a certificate of sponsorship. And for the visa application fees, it's slightly lower cost there, and the costs are up on the slide, which again vary depending on the length of the visa. And there is also a discount for the shortage occupation list, and then the charge for the NHS, which is the same. But usually a visa application from outside, from the point where the person submits their supporting docs and the online form, is about 3 weeks. And you can sometimes purchase expedited services depending on which location you're applying from. So if we just move forward, and then just a word finally on record keeping and reporting. As I said, we'll cover this in much more detail in our Back to Basics 3 session, which, because it forms part of the kind of overall compliance obligations that go along with having a license. But there is a document online called Appendix D, if you Google it, record keeping, which tells you what documents to keep of the recruitment process. Although there isn't a resident labour market test, you still do need to retain certain documents. So look at that as you go through and bear that in mind. But as I said, we'll cover that in the next session. So I think we've got a couple of minutes, hopefully, just for some questions and answers. If we run on, do feel free to drop off on the hour. But Erin, do you have any questions coming in?
Sure, yeah. So we've had a question that asks, if we assign a certificate of sponsorship and the employee doesn't come and work for us, can we recoup any of the costs that we've paid out?
So you can't recoup the cost of the certificate of sponsorship itself, nor the visa application fees, but it may be possible to recoup some of the immigration skills charge, so that employer tax, if the person doesn't come to work for you, and if they have paid the costs towards the NHS. Do you know what the situation is there, Erin?
Yes, so the NHS surcharge can be claimed back in some limited circumstances, but it would need to be the individual themselves that claimed that back, not the employer. So in most cases, that's okay because the employees paid it, but it's just worth bearing in mind the employer themselves cannot make the application for a refund.
Okay, and there's a question here, somebody asking, I think, about the minimum salary requirements, saying, is that a salary? What's the maximum number of hours per week, if so? So the sort of general minimum salary threshold dimensions, say the 25,000 odd, that is in, I guess that is a sort of minimum salary. There are rules about sort of prorating if the individual is going to be working less, and for the going rate for the particular job code where there's a minimum salary, if you look up the job code, it will break it down into an hourly rate. So it will tell you for that particular job code, say it was for marketing executive, it will have a sort of salary, but it will also then say, for example, £15 per hour as the minimum rate. But I would say there are really detailed rules on salary requirements, both for the general salary threshold and the going rate. And it is worth checking the guidance on that. And you can generally only count sort of salary rather than any benefits, etc. on that front. Maybe just one final question, and then we'll come back to you separately if we've not managed to get to your questions. So I've got one here. What happens if we put the wrong details on the cause? Can it be changed?
Yes, so I guess when you input the info on the certificate of sponsorship, it then kind of closes down and you can't normally change it. But there is a way to kind of put in what we call a sponsor note, and whether or not that's appropriate depends on what's actually been input incorrectly on the certificate of sponsorship. UKVI say that a significant error would result in a whole new certificate of sponsorship being required, and that's things like if you've just put the wrong job code in, if you've put or if you've used a skilled worker cost when it should have been an intra-company transfer cost, for example, or if you've made a kind of catalogue of errors, so if you've put typos across numerous different areas of the certificate of sponsorship, it's probably likely you're going to need a whole new cost itself. But if you've just made a singular typo, for example, in the spelling of their name or in the spelling of their job title, it's likely that you can just correct that by adding a sponsor note onto the certificate of sponsorship itself.
Great. Well, I think that's time to finish up now. If you do have other questions, please do contact us, and there's a feedback form that will just take 1 minute. I think it's just 5 quick questions. If you've got time to complete that, would be very grateful, because it's useful to have that for future sessions. And thank you for joining us. Thanks.
Thanks.